Hi, happy Wednesday to you, and I'd like to share some thoughts today about something I think is very heartbreaking and difficult for all of us. Have you ever lost a friend? Now, I don't mean death, I mean when you lose a friendship because of a disagreement. Sometimes I almost think it's easier to lose a friend through death than it is to lose a friend through a broken relationship, because in death we can grieve the relationship because it's gone, and it's life took its natural course and death occurred, and we can move on from that. But when it's a broken relationship, that person is still with us. We still see that person, and it's so difficult to deal with. Sometimes it's because of an intentional act where one person hurt another person. Sometimes it's an unintentional, careless thing that we say to that person, and the result of that is a broken relationship. Sometimes suddenly we find friends that are no longer speaking because of a disagreement. It's become worse, I think, in recent years because of social media. That's made it much worse, and the terrible political environment that we have right now. The preacher's Sunday sermon was on forgiveness, forgiving your enemies. And toward the end of the service, he asked his congregation, how many of you have forgiven your enemies? And everybody in the congregation responded, except one small elderly lady. Mrs. Jones, inquired the preacher, are you not willing to forgive your enemies? She says, I don't have any. She replied, smiling sweetly, Mrs. Jones, that is very unusual. How old are you? She says, I'm 93. Oh, Mrs. Jones, what a blessing and such a testament to all of us, how you have been able to forgive all of those people who might have offended you, and in 93 years, not have a single enemy in the world. And the little sweetheart of a lady faced the congregation and said, yeah, it's because I outlived all the old hags. Well, that's kind of what most of us are too, I think, when we look at our enemies and we realize that we're not always very forgiving toward them. We look in the Bible, in the Old Testament, we see David and trying to forgive Saul and trying to reform the relationship that he once had with Saul, even though Saul was angrily trying to kill David. We see David and his own son Absalom, when it was a son against a father, and what a heartbreaking story that is about David and Absalom. And then there's a story, then we get into the New Testament, and there's Jesus, and we think of Jesus who and his falling out, I guess we could call it, with Judas who betrayed Jesus. And then we see Paul and Barnabas, who also had a falling out. Two preachers, and they had a disagreement, and for a while, it didn't seem like they had much of a relationship. Think of Jesus for a minute, who fed 5,000 people on a hillside in Galilee. And he preached to them. When he traveled, when he walked the roads of Galilee and Samaria and all the different areas of the country, when he walked the roads, large crowds followed him, maybe by the thousands, and they witnessed his miracles. And yet, as he hung on the cross, just a handful of women stood at the foot of that cross. He even cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He felt even forsaken by his heavenly Father. It doesn't get any worse than that. The reality is, folks, is we're going to lose friendships. It's going to happen to us. If it hasn't happened to you yet, I don't think you're telling the truth. But I do think that there's always ways that we can preserve relationships, and I think we should make every effort to preserve relationships. First thing is humility. Think of someone who has forsaken us. Think of somebody who has cut you off, talked behind your back, and even alienated us from other people by talking behind our backs. The single characteristic that is the greatest friendship destroyer is the lack of humility and grace. And it's always easiest for us to point that out in the life of somebody else. We can see this lack of humility and grace in this friend who cut us off. It's more difficult to look at our own heart, look at our own selves, and see that same thing. Therefore, if we want to restore a broken or damaged relationship, we need to show humility. We need to be humble. We need to show grace. We can't keep score of what they've done in the past and say, well, if they hadn't done that, then I'd be okay with it. No, that's not what Jesus is telling us to do at all. The second thing that we do is to be the first to apologize. It demonstrates our own humility and grace when we cut through all of the pride and the stubbornness of our own personality, and we take the first step in renewing that relationship. Now, I hesitate to mention this since it should never be our first action. But, it should be the very last resort, and that is sometimes people are toxic. Sometimes people are so difficult that we should not necessarily have a relationship with that person. I hesitate to say this because way too often that becomes our weapon. We fall out of relationship with someone and we immediately categorize them as toxic. Oh, they're so toxic. And we use that word, we throw it around like it's rice at a wedding. But we do this because we are unable and unwilling to recognize in ourselves that we might be the toxic person in this relationship. So let that be our last resort. When we've exhausted all other possibilities, then sometimes even Jesus says in Matthew 18 that if that person is unrepentant after they've been brought before the church and everything else, then treat them as an unbeliever. Write them off. We have the right to do that at some point. And I hesitate to say that because I don't think that should be a very common thing that we do. We cannot fix other people, it's true. But we can fix ourselves, and we can restore a relationship as good as we possibly can. In general, we are called to be peacemakers. That's what Jesus wants us to be. Even when our friends walk away from us, it's being like Jesus when we are called to restore a relationship. That is being Christ-like. May God help you be a restorer of relationships. May you have a great day today. God bless.